Welcome to our FB meeting. We're really lucky today to have Usman Ahmed with us. Usman has been a long friend. As a matter of fact, I've known him for more than 30 years now. We were both young. I don't know how we maintained this don't pull it I see. So anyways, just to be serious for a second, Usman is a Bachelor of Science in Petroleum Engineering at A&M in about 1977. He went on and did his Master's in Petroleum at A&M. So I would ask anybody that wants to tell Aggie jokes, just hold off. After that, he worked at TerraTech until 1984, so he is familiar with Salt Lake. He spent time there. 5 years for Schlumberger. And then after that period of time, for the last 5 years, I guess. How long is it that long? What? How long have you been with Baker?
3.5.
3.5 years. He has been Baker's Chief Reservoir Engineer and Global Strategist. And so with that, I just like to welcome Usman and
Thank you, John. Whenever there's a reference, I've known him for 30 years, automatically everybody figures out you've been around the block. And yes, I have. Again, also a real thanks to Ray Levy for giving me a very good tour of this place, and I'm quite impressed the amount of kind of work that is being done, not only in shale reservoirs and unconventional reservoirs, which I'll be talking about, but as well as geothermal and enhanced oil recovery. Thank you, Ray. Appreciate it. So, without further delay, those of you who may not know, out of about 120,000 SPE members, annually there is about 25 or 30 distinguished lecturers are picked. And distinguished lecturers' topics normally is what is happening today. It does not look quite as much as what is happening in the future, which is what a lot of you are working on right over here. So without further delay, with so much expertise right over here in unconventional reservoirs, find up a little story about, and you can use the story for a physician or a scientist. Well, let's just say a scientist right over here. This particular scientist is going from city to city and giving a talk on some great discovery that he or she has done. And so they just gave a talk in Denver, and the chauffeur is driving him to Salt Lake City. So on the way driving over here, the chauffeur said, "Hey, Bob, I've listened to your talk so many times. You give the same talk over and over again. Why don't you relax in Salt Lake City in the auditorium, and I'll give you a talk?" Bob says, "Hey, that sounds like a great idea." So here's the chauffeur, gets up there, huge crowd, the entire room is filled up, and he gives the talk, flawless, no problem. And somebody in the audience gets up and asks a question. And the chauffeur says, "Oh, that's such a trivial question. I'll have my chauffeur at the end of the background over there answer the question." So a number of you might end up becoming my chauffeur today. So without further delay, I will go to the topic. And the main thing is as a matter of fact, my title says everything that I'm going to really cover. Okay? Developing unconventional reservoirs is rather simple if you can do two things correctly. Know where to place the well and know where to place your frac stages. If you can do that correctly, it is as simple as that. But that task that I just mentioned is not an easy one, because reservoirs and more so shale is highly heterogeneous. So with that introduction, let's proceed. Again, you will see in my outline, I'll talk a little bit about what the prize is or the resource, what are some of the challenges, and how are we addressing that. And going back, optimally placing the well back stages. I'll use about 4 examples from various parts of U.S. To talk about these examples. Even though my talk is related to unconventional, and that includes shale, tight oil and gas, and coal bed methane. The technologies are quite similar. However, my focus on today's talk is going to be on shale. So here's the price. A lot of you may have already seen this slide, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time showing the distribution of tight gas in blue, yellow in shale gas, and black in red methane. So it's about, as you can see, a huge resource, about 44,000 trillion cubic feet. Now, a lot of you may have seen this slide. What you may not have seen is the next slide, which is very similar to this, that looks into tight oil. And here is the unconventional oil resources globally. And you can take a look at it. It is anywhere between 2 to 3 trillion barrels of oil. I know a lot of us are quite focused on the Baker Shale right over here. We think that it is a huge reservoir. But if you take a look at the Bashanov Shale in Russia, it is 80 times the size of the Baker Shale. So we're talking about a significant amount of resources that are out there and that can be developed. And I was glad to see that a lot of work is being done here in almost every area that I've mentioned right over here. A lot of futuristic work is being done right at this office in order to understand the future development. Now, before I go into more details, I want to share with you information as to where we are coming from. So, of course, everybody knows that Barnett Shale development is where everything got started. Even though there are some Bakken wells even before Barnett in the late 70s and early 80s. So here is what I have on the vertical scale is the gas production over a 6-month period, indicating what the wells are. And on the horizontal scale is the timeline, January of 81 to pretty much early part of this year, and showing an evolution of what has happened in that particular field of shale development. The black triangles are vertical wells with single-stage fracture. The green dots that you see, they're laterals. And the red squares are horizontal wells with multi-stage fracture. Now, here's the first horizontal well that was drilled. Now, you can see right over here, the results of the first horizontal well is no better than any of the vertical wells at that period in time. And this is the consequences of doing research one well. You only have a 50-50 chance, either you get it right or you don't. Well, it didn't get it right. Then again, horizontal wells were tried roughly around 99, 2000. Same thing again, when you try one well, you got 50-50 chance. And then, over a period of time, when horizontal wells with a lot of multi-stage fracturing was done, you can see there's a big shift of production towards much more better wells. Now, that's not the end of the story. I got some more data which I'm going to put in right now. So, to me, the best conclusion and observation I get out of here is, look, there's a whole bunch of horizontal wells with multi-stage fracturing that did not do any better than the vertical wells. And that's where it leads me to my topic, is a good reason for these wells not doing very well is because either the wells were not put in the right place, or if the wells were even put in the right place, the frac stages were not put in the right place. Hopefully that is what I'll be sharing with you. This is just a trend to show at the U.S. what has happened over the years. Basically, the lateral length increased over a period of time, frac stages increased over a period of time. And over the years, the production, i.e., and decline has increased over the years. But there's one constant similarity between all these years is that all of these wells have a sharp decline. And whoever can solve that problem has a lot of big prize awaiting for them. And I'm going to show you some of the things that we are doing. I know Ian Walton right over here is working, as a matter of fact, Ray shared that with me about some of the prediction methods that he is deploying, and I'm more interested to see what Ian, as a matter of fact, I saw his presentation in Santa Fe. I'd like to discuss further. Anyway, I'm deviating from what, so let's go further. So having gleaned what we saw in the Barnett Shale, and now I'm going to show you a survey that was done by, not by us, but by some independent companies Welling and Company and Hart's E&P, and they interviewed a whole bunch of E&P operators in the U.S. And this is what they found. Seems like 7 out of 10 wells do not meet expectations. That's not very good, is it? 6 out of 10 frac stages are commercially ineffective. And when they were asked, why do you think so, is 73% of the operators thought that we did not know enough about the subsurface. Makes sense to the topic that I'm going to talk about, is if you had knowledge about the subsurface, you would place the wells in the right place, you would place the frac stages in the right place. So, I mean, if we want to be efficient and effective in these unconventional developments, we need to make sure that we know the subsurface. Having said that, I want you to just focus only on the top portion of this slide, because this is where everybody's interest is maximizing the rate return on investment. By and large, making money in shale play, you have a relatively small margin. So you have to do things right, okay? And so that means maximizing the reservoir contact, that's going to be key, and maximizing the initial production and knowing how to stop the real decline. So those are going to be the 2 key factors, and these are the details, and I will not be able to touch on everything, but I will touch on some of the important aspects of maximizing the return on investment. Now, just like any other development, I present this slide to ask you the question, is the unconventional workflow any different than conventional workflow? Some of you may disagree the answer I'm going to give you. By and large, the short answer is there is no difference in the workflow of unconventional versus conventional. You go through the same process of understanding your subsurface. Lithophases modeling is a very key important thing, which we will see later on. Bring in the geomechanics, decide on your well path, decide on frac stage location, ultimately end up with economics. Now, what is different is what goes into this modeling. In conventional reservoirs, what are some of the important things that we deal with? The reservoir pressure, permeability, porosity, saturation, reservoir extent. Those are the important parameters. There's only one of them out of those 5 in conventional items that relate to shales, and that is the reservoir pressure. I'm not saying that the permeability, porosity, and saturation is not important, but it's a secondary parameter. Other important parameters are, as most of you know, total organic content, vitrinite reflectance, thermal maturity, and reservoir pressure, as I mentioned to you earlier. So we're doing the same process, but essentially it's the different parameters that we're putting emphasis on. Now, I'm going to touch a little bit right over here and then come back later on. What are the 3 key elements to avoid that sharp production decline that I mentioned to you earlier? Is, of course, the hydraulic fracture model that we use. As I'll show you later on, that to effective development of shale reservoirs is not going to be good enough just by being able to model the longitudinal fracture. You'll have to find ways to create what I call a huge shear failure envelope around the longitudinal fracture. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. And for which, of course, you have to devise the grid pattern, unstructured grid pattern, to take into account what I just mentioned on this modeling. And, of course, bring in the reservoir flow model. This slide basically emphasizes this point right over here, that we cannot rely on the decline curves and ARPS type of method in unconventional reservoir. It just simply doesn't work, because you can almost draw any line you want to with the initial decline. So that's not going to work. In our own organization, the method that we've used a term called shale engineering. It is not only engineering, it includes geophysics, geology, and all other aspects. But that's what we are referring, calling it by. Now, let's start to the meat of the talk about finding the right spot for the well. irrespective of what your passion and sport is, whether it is tennis, baseball, or golf, you recognize that every one of those racket or ball or golf club has a sweet spot to get that perfect shot. And the unconventional reservoirs or shale reservoirs are no different, as we will see in this next slide. And a lot of you are quite familiar with this, is when the three important aspects of geochemical, geomechanical, and geological cross into that red spot, that's where my sweet spot is, which means I have to have a combination of TOC, kerogen type, litho phases, brittleness, stress regime, reservoir pressure, on all of them coalesce into a place, that's where my sweet spot is. And we're going to try to explain to you and show you some examples what we are doing in order to address that. And of course, we will see that sweet spots are not contiguous. So before I go into showing some of the sweet spots, I want to use this example from the Barnett Shale to again show how, remember I said unconventional is a low margin, so we have very little room for mistakes. So let's take a look at this example. Here are 5 laterals from 2 pads. Here are 3 laterals, and here's 2. And of course, everybody recognizes all the different colors are the microseismic measurement. About 10 to 12 stages were done in each of these 5 wells. So roughly about 50 stages were done right over here. Those of you who are not familiar too much with microseismic, I'll just mention maybe a couple of words. What microseismic really is just a slippage of rock. And when it slips, it sends out PNS waves. By no means ever confuse yourself that the dot is telling you the fracturing fluid has gone there, let alone any proppants has gone there. So we need to be cognizant of the fact. I think microseismic is a very good tool, but we need to know the positives and the limitations. I've seen some tracer work being done right over here. I think it looks quite promising. So anyway, after all the frac jobs were done, they were all cleaned up, and then production logging tools were run. After 6 months of cleanup and everything. And the results show that not a single frac stage in this 3 laterals produced commercial amount of hydrocarbon. The central frac stages on these 2 wells came on like gangbusters. It did not produce much from the toe and the heel, but in the middle section, it was highly commercial. So now let's take a look at it. Why? Here is the seismic attribute analysis when tied with the litho phases. That's what we're finding out is the sweet spot identification. Whether you take a look at actual amplitude or RMS amplitude, what you'll quickly see just by the colors is my real sweet spot is the red and the yellow. As I move towards light blue and darker blue, I am losing my potential zones right over here. So I think it becomes quite obvious from these plots why these 3 laterals did not produce and why the middle section of these 2 laterals came on like a gangbuster. Now, from Barnett, I'm going to move to Haynesville to show you, again, the combination of using the various seismic attributes for TOC, brittleness, reservoir pressure, some of the key parameters, and hone in to what my sweet spot ought to be. Sorry. Jesus, this is what happens when you got thick fingers. So here, what we're looking at right over here is the magenta color is the preferred TOC in this particular field. Of course, as I said, you have to combine it with TOC, brittleness, reservoir pressure, a number of those key parameters. And of course, if I were the operator, these are some of the places I would exploit first. Going into orange or yellow does not mean that I'm not going to produce anything. All that means is that should not be my primary, that should be my secondary development spots or pad locations. Now, I have to say right off the bat is that not a single set of attributes are applicable to every single field. That attribute selection is going to vary from place to place. Now, some attributes will remain constant, okay? Like the acoustic impedance, okay? It has been shown clearly the higher the TOC, the lower is the acoustic impedance, and the same thing goes for the higher the natural fracture swarms, the lower is the acoustic impedance. So coming again to the development phase of the Haynesville project, of course, in every unconventional resource development, you start with the pilot well, vertical pilot wells. So what we're looking right over here is, these are all the pilot wells. First, I'm going to focus on these 6 wells, pilot wells, that was drilled where there was not a sweet spot, okay, just to prove the concept. And you can see, sure enough, this is production versus time, and all those 6 wells fall at the bottom. Now, when we take a look at the wells that were drilled in the sweet spots, we can see that the production is significantly higher and is also sustained at a much more higher rate. Again, giving credibility to using seismic attributes and lithophases to address the placement of the wells. Now, this is kind of, as a matter of fact, this work was seen in APG Explorer 2009, put out by Statoil, where they discovered the shale zones by mistake. They were not looking for shale. But basically in this paper, they pretty much outline how they're going to track the high TOC areas and essentially place their wells. And that's what I'm going to show in the next slide, is the key is in the vertical well is where I need to, okay, get my foundation correct, which means I should have all the appropriate data, as I mentioned to you earlier, including natural fractures and their frequency, and also try to find out if there are faults, karst, and hazards to avoid. I know a lot of times we use faults to connect to a fracture swarm, but more than norm, you end up losing your hydraulic fractures in those faults, and there's always a good possibility if there's a close-by aquifer, you might go right into the aquifer. So those are some of the things to avoid. So here's this slide that comes from Marcella's case study, basically showing the use of azimuthal resistivity and gamma ray images to essentially, track the well in the high probability area of success section of the formation. Now, if you have a very thick zones, there are alternate ways of placing your wells. You may have multiple laterals, or you may have drop down, number of different scenarios that can take place. This slide, I just put it out there just to emphasize some of the important parameters that is needed in the initial stages of your understanding and creating the foundation for your reservoir, from geochemistry to lithology to fracture detection through image logs, core analysis, total organic content, on and on. I've kind of put a list of the things that you need to be cognizant of. Now, later on as you move to your development, you may not need to do all those things. That's where what I call it's better to be cost-effective development than low cost. If you do low cost, which a lot of operators did in the U.S., they did statistical drilling with ignoring any of this information. And that's why do you think 70% of the wells were put in the wrong place? Anyway, the reason I have this slide is for only one simple reason, is that mineralogy significantly varies from shale to shale. As you can see, the Barnett has got a lot more sandstone, whereas the Eagle Ford has a lot more calcite and a lot less sandstone, and whereas the Monte right over here has an average amount of sandstone. And that has an impact not only on your drill bits and drilling scenario, but also in the treatment fluids that you will be choosing for this particular reservoir. Now, remember I mentioned that presence of natural fracture is very key. Today in the industry, whether it is water-based mud or the oil-based mud, you have resistivity image tools available to at least pick up the natural fractures at the wellbore. Of course, you can use seismic curvature analysis to find out fracture swarms away from your wellbore. And I'll show you a little bit later some of the new deep reading shear acoustic tools that are available, that from the wellbore, it can pick up natural fractures about 70 to 80 meters away from the wellbore. I wanted to use this example right over here that is coming from the Eagle bird, just to show a section of it as to how do I decide where should I put my frac stages and where should I avoid. But that, of course, requires that imaging tool information that I mentioned to you right over here. This tool system that you're looking at right over here is the ball activator sleeve opening and closing for your frac stages. So I'm just only going to show a section of it right over here. So the first section right over here, it shows that I've got fall system. So unless I know that this fall system will take me to a fracture swarm, the best thing for me to do is avoid putting a frac stage at this location. Now I come to these two sections right over here where I see nice development of fracture swarms. These would be two good places for me to put two frac stages right over here and move on to the next section. The next section is what I see by the pattern of this fracture system tells me that this fracture system is coming from hydraulic fractures that were put forth in an adjacent well. So by and large, I will probably not benefit by putting in a frac at this location. Of course, you have to evaluate what is that adjacent well, where it is. You have to use your judgment. But by and large, this may be a waste of a frac stage. Excuse me. So here again, I see nice development of natural fractures, so a good place to put my frac stages. And then we have seen this over and over again is at least in longer laterals, your lithofaces may change. And what that may ultimately indicate that I may be wasting a frac stage right over here because the hydrocarbon may not be there. So this is in a short showing you how do I pick my frac stages. So instead of doing what's called the geometric frac every 250 feet, the ideal thing would be is to go towards put the frac stage where it is needed and avoid where it should not be. So this is a deep shear wave imaging tool that I was mentioning to you earlier. Is not only you will be able to pick up the fracture that is cutting through the wellbore, but also if there is a fracture swarm up to about 70 meter away. So this tool has been used in a number of different cases where even though you do not have the fracture swarms at the wellbore, but if you see the fracture swarm away, you can still put a stage at the wellbore and hopefully connect to the fracture swarm that is at a distance. Now, moving forward from here, we all recognize that in the next 5 to 10 years, the estimate shows about 100,000 wells will be drilled, and anywhere between 1 to 2 million hydraulic fracture stages will be put on this well, which means hundreds of billions, if not close to $1 trillion, is going to be spent doing these frac jobs. So it is upon us to do the right thing of knowing where to place the wells and the frac stages. And as we move from North America, these are some of the countries that we see picking things up in order for the development. Of course, in the Western Hemisphere, some of the promising ones. I just heard today, visiting over here, that UK is also looking very good. Russia and the countries that I point out: Russia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, China, and Croatia, as well as Australia. Why did I separate them out? Because we see the countries where the government is behind it, those are the countries that are going to move faster, okay? Because they will break down the regulations that is needed. In the Western Hemisphere, of course, it is Colombia to take the lead, Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil as before. So as we move outside North America, we need to also optimize a lot of these things that I'm mentioning. Now I'm going to spend a little time with you to talk about how do we typically produce from this nano Darcy rock. And and that permeability is lower than the permeability of the cement sheet that is around the casing. So what our work has shown that the best productive zones is when I not only put a longitudinal fracture, but because of the presence of natural fractures, can I modify my hydraulic fracturing pumping process in order to create this elliptical high shear failure envelope to give me that high fracture face that is connected to the wellbore. So we did some of this work, as a matter of fact, in conjunction, I wish I could say University of Utah, but it was done with Stanford, is how these are being created. So I'm going to show you one plot right over here, basically showing here's the permeability, and here is the pore pressure increase as we are injecting hydraulic fracture treatment. And this green dotted line is the permeability pattern with increase in pore pressure. Now, as the pore pressure reaches and makes the natural fracture slip, that's when it takes a leap to this red line right over here and follows this pattern. And when I'm done with the fracturing and reduce the pressure, it does not follow the hysteresis path. It follows this particular path right over here. Numerous experiments have shown that because these are not totally closed, okay, even though there are no prophets, or may not be prophets. That's probably a better word. So you can see at the end of the day, you can increase the permeability in order to orders of magnitude. And this process, then we implement it into our hydraulic fracturing model and see if we can predict actual production. So I'll come to that later on, but this shows the model right here. These green cells, of course, is the virgin box right over here. And the red that you're looking at right over here is the stimulated reservoir volume that we will use in order to calculate or predict what the production ought to be. This is again a cartoon slide depicting the process where the green is the natural fractures. Here's the hydraulic fracture I put in. Here's the horizontal well. Basically, cartoon-wise, it's showing the process. So here's an example from the Marcellus. Here you're seeing about 9 frac stages. Can you tell that they are not geometric? They're not placed at every 250 feet. They are spaced and placed where they ought to be. Okay, and here is the red bars right over here is the production as predicted by the model that I just showed you a little earlier, and the blue is the actual production after cleanup. With the exception of 1 or 2, I think overall for oil field purposes, I feel that the agreement is pretty good. We're still working on the model. It's a work in progress. It's not totally a done deal. We still got a lot to. If anybody comes and tells you we know how to predict, I'll be a little leery because I'm not so sure we're all fully at that conclusion yet. So these are some of the details of that particular part. Now I'm coming to the economics part, which is basically how many. Even if I have good places to put frac stages, there's always a limit, economic limit, not production limit of the frac stages. What I have over here on the vertical scale is net present value, which is basically the revenue you are generating from production minus the cost of the drilling and the various frac stages. And each of these lines show what the NPV would look like for the first year, and the last one is for 40 years. By and large, I've done all these many plots just to make one point, is in this particular case, this is a simulated case, this is not a field case. It shows that anywhere between after 7 to 18 frac stages, your NPV is not increasing anymore. So that means I am not doing justice to my financial part of the company. My production might increase, but I might be better off putting more wells and less frac stages in each of them. But that's a total field development plan that we can get into. Now, as I said, this is for this set of data. We have seen certain cases where 10 to 12 may be the limit, And we have gone and seen up to 45 frac stages being the right thing to do in Bakken. Doesn't necessarily mean that every Bakken well is going to be that way. Now what I wanted to show a little bit to you is how the nanotechnology is coming into the oil field. I know a lot of you over here are also working on the nanotechnology, and this is the same system that I mentioned to you, is the ball-activated sleeve opening and closing. And you can see these are the balls, and the smallest diameter ball goes first to open up the first, and the largest ball usually goes, well, not usually, always goes for the last one, okay? And the issue with these kind of ball-activated sleeves is that you have to essentially produce all these balls away. A lot of times they might get jammed and cause you losing portion of your well. So what has been done is create these balls right over here that are functionalized with nanomaterial. What that does is that it makes it lighter than aluminum and yet stronger than steel. And then when it comes into interaction with the reservoir fluids at a certain temperature, it starts to dissolve. Okay? The functionalized material breaks down, and essentially after a certain time, it totally dissolves. Now what I wanted to just touch a little bit right over here is this, as I mentioned to you before, that the fact that there is a microseismic dot, that does not necessarily mean that it is where I'm producing from. I still need a good viable technique in order to understand what my real stimulated reservoir volume is. And that's why the reason I'm putting this slide up. We have about 4 case studies where we have taken volume calculations from microseismic, and then we have taken production curves for 6 months. So with those production curves, I went ahead, when I say I, some of the team members, went back and used this production data to calculate what is the stimulated reservoir volume. And then we compared those to the microseismic volume. And by and large, we see that the production-based SRV is about 25 to 35% of the microseismic estimated reservoir stimulated volume. Here is again another example coming from Haynesville area. There are various stages, and you can see the microseismic data that is coming in as the stages are completed. And then you see the production log information right over here. And of course, the microseismic intensity shows that these 3 zones should have a lot of production. But these zones are not producing as much as these zones. And as I pop up the information, you'll see why. It's because these zones do not have enough natural fractures for me to create that shear failure envelope like I have for these zones right over here. So these are some of the critical things that allows us to decide where I should be putting some of the frac stages. Now, I just wanted to show a couple of slides right over here as to where we are heading with the modeling work. Basically, what you're looking at right over here is 3 different scenarios where the natural fractures are horizontal, 45 degrees, vertical. So we're looking at each of these conditions and then also mixing them up. And what are we looking for? What we are looking for right over here, and I need to give you a little bit as I show the animation. What we're looking for right over here is again from the fracture model that I mentioned to you earlier, which is not only a longitudinal but also create the shear failure envelope. So what you'll be looking right over here is these are the 3 clusters, 1, 2, 3, and these dots are the microseismic dots, and the shadow that you see is the shear failure envelope as predicted from the model, and you will see when I look at the animation that it is smaller than the microseismic measurement. By no means, this is a done work. This is work in progress. So here are the 3 clusters. Now you can start seeing the microseismic measurements. You can start seeing, you're picking up microseismic way out there to begin with. And so and now you can see the shadow is trying to pick up or at least predicting what the stimulated reservoir volume is. And it has some sort of a correction software. It picks up a little bit higher and then comes back down, you know. So anyway, the main thing that I'm showing this is just to give you an idea that we don't think the problem is solved, and so that's a work in progress. So that brings me to my conclusion slide, and my conclusion slide is no different than my title slide, as a matter of fact. Shale resource is not contiguous, and no two shale basins are the same. Sweet spot identification is going to be very critical with the combination of lithophases and seismic attributes. And as I mentioned, different shales will require the knowledge of different sets of attributes. Geometric placement of hydraulic fracture stages needs to be replaced by shale productivity-based parameters, which means capitalizing on the presence of natural fractures, fracture swarms away from the wellbore, and avoiding hazards and potentially falls, basically avoiding them. So that's pretty much takes me to the end of my prepared presentation. I would be very glad to try to answer my questions, or some of my chauffeurs in the audience will answer it for me.